Is there anything in the Jobs Act you like?
Yeah, I like the fact that the president has a nice signature at the bottom. His signature looks good.
So the Jobs Act is being pretty universally hailed as a rare moment of bipartisan agreement in Washington. But Eliot, don't you think that in many ways it overturns some of the signature accomplishments of your time as Attorney General?
Well, yes, it certainly does overturn some of the most important things we put in place when I was Attorney General, but more fundamentally, it was a moment of bipartisanship because both parties did what they do extremely well, which is to respond to lots of Wall Street lobbying, doing exactly what Wall Street has been encouraging for many years, which is to once again deregulate the markets in a way that will create risk and will create downstream opportunities for people to commit fraud. That's why I said it should be called the Bring Fraud Back to Wall Street Act, not because there aren't ways we can streamline the regulations, do things better in terms of capital formation. Of course we can. But some of the things the statute did and the entire ethos that it speaks to is to go back 4 years after one of the worst cataclysms we've ever faced, go right back to the same flawed ideology that deregulation is the answer rather than smart regulation.
So there were some real Silicon Valley stars who lobbied for this, and their pitch was, we are jobs creators. Don't tie our hands behind our backs. Let us get access to capital markets. What's wrong with that?
Look, no, they're right. They are jobs creators. I've always distinguished between the VC community, the venture capital world, where you have some of the best ideas, smartest people bringing new technologies into the marketplace. Their need to raise capital is genuine. We've got to make sure everything that can help that properly is done. On the other hand, there's a difference between doing that and saying, therefore, we want analysts, for instance, to be involved in the pitch to the businesses, which almost guarantees that analysts will end up lying to the public. The objective here is to have capital markets that raise capital, distribute capital, but do it in a way that is based upon integrity. Ease is not always a good thing. Ease is a good thing if it's within the parameters of integrity and forthright conversations with the public. Passing a law that says, gee, we don't want you to have financials for the first 5 years because even though you're a billion-dollar company, you don't think you want to hire an accountant and make anything public, doesn't make sense. As Matt Taibbi said, it's kind of like saying, we're going to say to baseball players, you don't need to take steroid testing for the first 5 years. There are going to be a lot of home runs hit in those first 5 years, and then once you start testing, you're going to say, oops, something's wrong here. The Jobs Act simply rolls back some of the simple principles that we put in place after the dot-com bubble, after the crash of '08, and it shouldn't have been passed. The bipartisanship merely reflects the fact that both parties respond to Wall Street lobbying.
Eliot, you just said that one of the real problems, one of the things you're worried about, is analysts being able to be part of pitches. What's so bad about that? And what does past experience tell us about that?
Well, look, as we all know, if you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it. The history is that when analysts are involved with investment banks going to the target companies saying, let us do the underwriting for you, let us handle your IPO, the analyst says either overtly or wink, wink, nod, nod, I will put a strong buy on your stock regardless of the underlying merit of the investment, which is exactly what happened, which was what led to the global settlement announced in December '02, signed in '03, that said to every major investment bank on the street, you can no longer let your analysts, who are supposed to be the voices to the public, let them be part of the pitch, let them be involved in actually handling the IPO, let them be compensated by the proceeds of the IPO. All of that leads to a conflict of interest that leads to lies and fraud when it comes time for the general public to invest. The Jobs Act rolls back the protections we put in place to ensure that analysts did not have incentives to lie.
One of the other points that supporters of the Jobs Act are really delighted by is, as they would put it, taking away the burden from younger, smaller companies of all this very onerous reporting to the authorities. Isn't that a good thing? I mean, aren't companies too tied up in red tape?
It depends. Look, the short answer is sure. We don't want people to be overburdened. I mean, that's it's a little bit of a leading question. Do you want to burden people with overburdensome regulations? No, of course we don't want to do that. The question is, how do you define what's overly burdensome? A billion-dollar company can probably afford to have an accountant. If they don't have an accountant, you'd better be wondering why you're investing with them. I mean, Bernie Madoff said, oh, my goodness, I don't want to be burdened with an accountant other than this P.O. box up in Muncie, New York. Surprise, surprise, it was a Ponzi scheme. It is not that difficult to have accountants take a look, do what needs to be done. The incremental cost of that accounting is a lot smaller than the cost to society of what we've just lived through in terms of the cataclysm of '08 or the dot-com bubble or the other events where the failure to have legitimate accounting and transparency led to real problems. Now, I'm not saying that what we had is perfect. By no means am I saying that. Of course, we can probably do better, have the SEC cut back in some areas, and have smart regulations replace burdensome stuff in other locations. Of course, look, I'm not a Luddite when it comes to how you regulate. Simplicity is the key, but what Congress passed is not that. What Congress passed is just a rollback of some fundamental principles.
Is there anything in the Jobs Act you like?
Yeah, I like the fact that the president has a nice signature at the bottom. His signature looks good.
That's the only good thing?
No, look, I'm sure there's some other stuff in there that I could find. What I don't like about it is, at a fundamental level, is the rush so quickly to repeal fundamental principles of transparency and obligation for straight talk in the marketplace. It is a mere 4 years after the worst cataclysm we've had since 1929, a cataclysm bred by the same deregulatory, self-regulatory, flawed philosophy that the Jobs Act once again embraced. And so I'm dissatisfied with what's in it, dissatisfied with the way it was passed. Understand, there were no meaningful inquiries held up on Capitol Hill about any of these areas. This was rushed through the same way the Republican majority in the House has rushed through all the other bills they've been pushing without any serious thought. Nobody called and said what has worked, what has not worked in the analyst settlement, which was one of the most fundamental shifts in the way Wall Street operated. Nobody did a serious analysis. All they did is take and accept lock, stock, and barrel what the Chamber of Commerce and the Business Council said. And I can tell you, every time I've poked even a little bit at their analyses, they've been wrong. You have to distinguish between the rhetoric and the reality. The president has given an occasional speech in which he has used some language that Wall Street has not liked when it has come to actually putting in place the sorts of reform-based regulations